Could what? Daniel asked, his eyes narrowing. Hurt your brand? Let me make this clear. If you don't act, I will. My team's already drafted a statement. One call, and this story goes beyond this room, beyond this station. But I'd rather it didn't. I'd rather you took responsibility, not because of who I am, but because it's right. Eleanor watched her son, a quiet pride in her eyes. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence was enough, her silence a reminder of why they were here. Miss Carter nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging slightly. You'll have everything you've asked for, Mr. Harper. In writing, within 48 hours. Daniel gave a single nod. Good, Miss Carter turned to Eleanor, her voice softer now. Mrs. Harper, if there's anything we can do for you. There is, Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. Make sure the next person who looks like me, who sits where I sat, isn't treated the way I was. That's all I want. Miss Carter swallowed, her eyes dropping briefly. Yes, ma'am. The meeting ended as quietly as it began. Daniel helped Eleanor to her feet, his touch gentle but firm. They walked back through the corridor, the security officer leading them to a private exit where a sleek black car waited. The station concourse buzzed beyond the glass doors, travelers oblivious to the storm that had just passed through their world. Eleanor stepped into the car, her shawl still stained, her head still high. Daniel followed, his tablet in hand, his mind already moving to the next step. As the car pulled away, Eleanor looked out at the station, her reflection faint in the tinted glass. She was young, she said softly, almost to herself. Vanessa. She was young. Daniel glanced at her, his jaw tight. Young doesn't excuse it. No, Eleanor agreed, but it means she has time to learn. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked out his own window, the station fading into the distance. Maybe, he said finally, but she'll learn because of you. Eleanor smiled faintly, her hands folding over her shawl. The car moved smoothly through the city, the hills rising in the distance, their green slopes a quiet promise of peace. The day wasn't over, but something had shifted. Not just in the train company, not just in Vanessa's world, but in the hearts of those who'd watched and done nothing. And that, Eleanor knew, was where the real change would begin. The black car glided through the city's edge, where skyscrapers gave way to rolling hills bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon. Inside, Eleanor sat quietly, her stained shawl draped across her lap like a quiet reminder of the day's wounds. Her hands rested still, but her eyes traced the landscape outside, fields stretching wide, trees swaying gently, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. Beside her, Daniel stared at his tablet, its screen dark now, his fingers hovering over it as if deciding whether to break the silence between them. The train incident lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy, a moment that had cracked something open in both of them. What no one could have predicted was how that moment would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the carriage, forcing a reckoning that refused to stay quiet. Before we dive deeper, let me ask, has a single moment ever changed the way you see the world? Maybe it was something small, something others overlooked, but it stayed with you. Share it in the comments below. It means so much to hear your stories. And if this tale's gripping you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you're ready for what's next. Let's keep going. The car turned onto a winding road, the hills growing closer, their slopes dotted with wildflowers that caught the fading light. Eleanor shifted slightly, her shawl brushing against the leather seat. The stain was drying now, its edges curling into the fabric, but she hadn't tried to cover it. She wore it openly, not as a mark of shame, but as a testament to her endurance. She'd carried worse than stains in her life, grief, dismissal, the weight of being unseen, and she'd learned long ago that hiding pain only gave it power. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was strength, the kind that didn't need words to be felt. Daniel glanced at her, his jaw tight, his eyes searching her face for something he couldn't name. "You sure you're okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice softer than before, almost hesitant. Eleanor turned to him, her smile faint but warm. "I'm still here, aren't I?" she said, her tone light but layered with meaning. "That's more than I can say for some days." He didn't smile back. His fingers tapped the edge of his tablet, a restless rhythm that betrayed the calm he projected. "I should have seen it coming," he said, almost to himself. "I should have known someone like her would—" "Would what?" Eleanor interrupted gently, her eyes holding his. "Look at me and decide I don't belong? You can't see every hurt before it happens, Daniel. Not even you. Her words hung between them, simple but piercing. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly, the weight of her truth settling in his chest. He'd spent years building a world where people like his mother were supposed to be safe. Systems that powered trains, hospitals, schools, all designed to make life fairer, kinder. But today, in that carriage, he'd seen how fragile that world was. How a single person's prejudice could unravel everything he'd worked for. It wasn't just about Vanessa's actions. It was about the silence that followed. The passengers who watched and did nothing. The system that let someone like her think she could get away with it. The car slowed as it approached a set of wrought iron gates, their sleek design blending into the landscape. Beyond them lay Daniel's countryside estate, a minimalist villa of glass and stone that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. The gates opened silently, and the car rolled forward, gravel crunching softly under the tires. The villa came into view, its clean lines softened by the orchard that surrounded it. Rows of apple trees heavy with fruit, their leaves rustling in the breeze. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary Daniel had built for moments like this, when the world felt too heavy to carry. As the driver opened Eleanor's door, a woman stepped out from the villa's entrance. Lila, Daniel's personal assistant, was in her early 40s, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, her smile warm but professional. "Mrs. Harper," she said, her voice steady. "Welcome. I've got tea ready inside if you'd like." Eleanor nodded, her hand brushing Lila's arm as she stepped out. "You're a blessing, Lila," she said, her voice carrying the kind of gratitude that felt earned. "Tea sounds perfect." Daniel followed, his tablet tucked under his arm, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if expecting trouble to follow them even here. Lila glanced at him, her expression shifting to something more cautious. "Your team's been in touch," she said quietly. "They're waiting for your call." He gave a curt nod, but didn't respond. He wasn't ready to dive back into the storm. Not yet. He needed this moment, this quiet with his mother, before the world demanded more of him. They walked together toward the villa, the orchard scent wrapping around them, sweet and grounding. Eleanor paused by a tree, her fingers brushing the rough bark, her eyes distant but calm. "You used to climb trees like these," she said suddenly, her voice soft with memory. "Back when we had nothing but a patch of dirt and a dream. You'd get so high I'd hold my breath, praying you wouldn't fall." Daniel stopped, a faint smile breaking through his tension. "I fell a few times," he said. "You always caught me." "Not always," Eleanor replied, turning to him. "But I tried." Her words weren't just about trees. They were about years of struggle, of late nights in cramped apartments, of her working double shifts to keep food on the table while he dreamed of a world bigger than their circumstances. She'd carried him through those years, not with wealth or power, but with love, fierce and unyielding. And today, in that carriage, he'd carried her. Not with anger, but with a resolve that echoed her own. Inside the villa, the air was cool and quiet, the scent of jasmine lingering from an open window. The living room opened onto a terrace, its glass doors framing the orchard in a way that made the world feel endless. Eleanor sank into a cream-colored armchair, her shawl slipping slightly to reveal the stain, now a faint shadow against the fabric. Lila appeared with a tray, tea in a delicate porcelain cup, a plate of shortbread, a folded blanket for Eleanor's lap. "Anything else you need?" she asked, her eyes kind but searching. Eleanor shook her head. "This is more than enough," she said, her smile genuine. "Thank you, dear." Lila nodded and glanced at Daniel, who stood by the terrace doors, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. "I'll be in the office if you need me," she said, then slipped away, her footsteps fading down the hall. Daniel turned to his mother, his expression unreadable. "I meant what I said back there," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about one attendant. It's about every time someone's been dismissed, ignored, made to feel less. I can't let it go." Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving his. "I know you can't," she said, "but don't let it eat you up either. Anger's a fire, Daniel. It warms you, but it burns if you hold it too long." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "It's not anger," he said, though his voice wavered just enough to betray him. "It's responsibility. You taught me that. To stand up when something's wrong, no matter who's watching." Eleanor's smile deepened, tinged with pride and something sadder. something that carried years of unspoken battles. I taught you to stand up, she said, but I also taught you to forgive. Not for them, for you. Her words landed softly, but they carried weight. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked out at the orchard, the trees swaying gently, their branches heavy with fruit that would soon fall. Forgiveness wasn't easy for him, not when it came to someone who'd hurt his mother, who'd stripped her dignity in front of strangers. But he knew she was right. Holding on to the hurt wouldn't undo it. It would only make it heavier. What would you do in Daniel's shoes? Would you forgive? Or would you fight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to know where you stand. Let's keep moving forward. Back at the train station, the concourse buzzed with its usual chaos. Travelers rushing to platforms, announcements crackling overhead, the clatter of luggage carts weaving through the crowd. But in a small office tucked behind a frosted glass door, the air was still, heavy with the aftermath of the day's events. Vanessa sat at a plain metal table, her uniform jacket unbuttoned, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her sat Miss Carter, the head of passenger relations, her tablet glowing with notes she hadn't yet shared. A security officer stood by the door, his presence a quiet reminder that this wasn't a casual meeting. "Miss Klein," Miss Carter began, her voice measured but firm, "we've reviewed the footage from the onboard cameras. It confirms the complaint filed by Mr. Harper. I'd like to hear your side." Vanessa's throat tightened, her eyes dropping to the table. She'd rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times since stepping off the train, but now, with Miss Carter's gaze on her, the words felt inadequate, hollow. I didn't mean for it to happen like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She kept pressing the call button, and I was busy, and I thought she was being difficult." Miss Carter's expression didn't change. "Difficult," she repeated, the word hanging in the air like an accusation. "Mrs. Harper asked for a cup of tea. She was polite, according to every witness we've spoken to. Yet you mocked her, ignored her, and then spilled tea on her shawl. Why?" Vanessa's hands trembled, her nails digging into her palms. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I looked at her, and she didn't seem like she belonged in business class. She was quiet, plain. I thought she was just someone who'd gotten a cheap upgrade, taking up space that wasn't hers." The honesty was raw, brutal in its clarity. Miss Carter leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping the edge of her tablet. "You made assumptions," she said, "and those assumptions led to actions that humiliated a passenger who happens to be the mother of Daniel Harper, whose company funds half the systems keeping this train running." Vanessa's face paled further, if that was possible. She'd heard whispers about Daniel's influence, but hearing it laid out like this, cold, factual, undeniable, made her stomach twist. "I didn't know who she was," she said, her voice desperate now. "If I'd known—" "It shouldn't have mattered," Miss Carter interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "Your job is to treat every passenger with respect, not just the ones who look like they belong in your idea of business class." Vanessa nodded, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to say she wasn't the kind of person who hurt others on purpose. But the footage didn't lie. The passenger's silence didn't lie. The stain on Eleanor's shawl didn't lie. She'd made a choice, and now she was sitting in its wreckage, her career unraveling with every word. Miss Carter slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is a formal notice of suspension," she said. "You're off duty until the investigation is complete. You'll have a chance to submit a written statement, but I'll be honest, Miss Klein, the evidence is clear. The company's taking this seriously, especially given Mr. Harper's involvement." Vanessa stared at the paper, her hands frozen in her lap. Suspension. The word echoed in her mind, heavy with consequences she hadn't fully grasped until now. She'd worked years to get here. Nights, weekends, endless training sessions, all to wear this uniform, to stand tall in front of passengers who trusted her to make their journey smooth. And in one moment, one careless, cruel moment, she'd thrown it all away. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Miss Carter's expression softened, but only slightly. "That depends on the investigation," she said. "And on Mr. Harper. He's requested changes, training, accountability measures, a public memo to investors. He's not asking for your job, not explicitly, but he's making sure this doesn't happen again." Vanessa nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She signed the paper with a trembling hand, the pen scratching against the page like a confession. Miss Carter stood, her tablet tucked under her arm. "You're free to go," she said. "But I suggest you take this time to think about what happened. Really think." Vanessa rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked out of the office. The concourse was a blur of faces and noise, but she felt alone, as if the world had pulled back, leaving her to carry the weight of her actions in silence. She didn't know where to go, home maybe, or somewhere quiet where she could unravel the knot in her chest. All she knew was that Eleanor's face, Daniel's voice, the sound of that cup hitting the table, they'd stay with her, no matter how far she ran. Have you ever made a mistake you couldn't take back? Something that changed how you saw yourself? Share it in the comments if you're willing. It's a heavy question, but it connects us all. Let's return to Eleanor and Daniel. At the villa, night had fallen, the sky a deep indigo scattered with stars. The terrace was lit by soft lanterns, their glow casting shadows across the stone floor. Eleanor sat in a cushioned chair, a fresh shawl around her shoulders, this one clean, a soft gray that matched the quiet of the evening. The orchard stretched out before her, its trees silvered by moonlight, the air carrying the faint scent of apples and earth. She held a cup of tea untouched, her eyes lost in the distance. Daniel stood nearby, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived, letting the silence between them breathe. But now, as the night deepened, he felt the need to break it. "I got a message from the company," he said, his voice low. "They've started the suspension process for Vanessa. Training's being rolled out next week." Eleanor nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "That's good," she said, though her tone carried a trace of something else, sorrow maybe, or resolve. "But it's not just about her, is it?" Daniel turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" She set the cup down, her movements slow, deliberate. "It's about all of them," she said. "The passengers who watched, the ones who didn't speak, the company that let someone like her think she could treat me that way. It's about the world that looks at someone like me and decides I'm not worth a kind word." Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in it, a quiet strength that made Daniel pause. He'd seen her like this before, rare moments when the weight of her life, her struggles, her triumphs came pouring out. She wasn't just talking about the train. She was talking about years of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Years of smiling through it, of carrying herself with grace when others offered none. "You're right," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "It's bigger than one moment. That's why I'm pushing for change, not just for you, but for everyone who's ever felt what you felt today." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes glistening in the lantern light. "You've always carried the world on your shoulders," she said. "Ever since you were a boy, you wanted to fix everything. But some things you can't fix. You can only make them better." Daniel didn't respond right away. He walked to the edge of the terrace, his hands gripping the railing, the cool metal grounding him. "I can try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For you, I'll always try." Eleanor rose from her chair, crossing the terrace to stand beside him. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "You already have," she said. "Today, you reminded them I'm here, that I matter. That's more than I ever dared to hope for." Her words broke something in him, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that healed. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, he wasn't the magnate, the innovator, the man who moved mountains with a single call. He was just her son, standing in the quiet of a night that felt like it belonged to them alone. The stars above burned brighter now, their light a silent promise that some moments, no matter how painful, leave a mark that can't be erased. The train incident wasn't just a story of cruelty or confrontation. It was a story of love, of a son's fierce devotion, of a mother's unshakable grace. And as Eleanor and Daniel stood together, the orchard whispering around them, they knew the story wasn't over. It was spreading, touching hearts they'd never meet, changing lives in ways they couldn't yet see. Back at the station, Vanessa walked through the concourse, her bag slung over her shoulder, her steps slow and heavy. The lights were too bright, the noise too loud, but she barely noticed. She passed a group of staff members whispering near a coffee stand, their eyes flicking toward her before looking away. She passed a digital billboard advertising the train's cutting-edge technology, its slogan glowing in bold letters. Travel with ease, arrive with pride. The irony twisted in her gut, a reminder of the pride she'd let guide her, the ease she'd denied someone else. She stopped by a bench near the exit, sinking onto it as if her legs couldn't carry her any further. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from Claire. "You okay? Call me if you need to talk." Vanessa stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button, but she didn't type anything. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the shame that clung to her like a second skin. She'd always thought of herself as good at her job, as someone who made people's days better. But today, she'd seen a different version of herself. One she didn't recognize, one she didn't want to be. Across the concourse, Miss Carter stood in a quiet corner, speaking into her phone. "Yes, Mr. Harper's team has been informed," she said, her voice low. "The memo's being drafted tonight. We're moving as fast as we can." She paused, listening, then nodded. "I understand. We'll make sure this sets a precedent, not just a headline." The call ended, and Miss Carter looked out at the concourse, her eyes landing on Vanessa for a brief moment. She didn't approach, didn't speak, but her gaze carried a weight, a reminder that actions had consequences, that moments like this didn't vanish with an apology. Vanessa felt it, even from a distance, and lowered her head, her hands tightening around her bag. The night stretched on, carrying the echoes of the day's events into the lives of everyone touched by it. For Eleanor, it was a moment of pain, but also of power, a reminder that her voice, spoken or silent, mattered. For Daniel, it was a call to action, a vow to build a world where no one had to endure what his mother had. For Vanessa, it was a mirror, forcing her to confront the person she'd become and the person she could still choose to be. And for the passengers who'd watched in silence, it was a memory they'd carry, a question they'd ask themselves in quiet moments. Why didn't I speak up? What do you think of Vanessa's story so far? Is there a chance for redemption, or are some mistakes too heavy to lift? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm all ears. And if this story's moving you, give it a like to let me know you're with us. The villa was quiet now, the lanterns dimmed, the terrace empty. Eleanor had gone inside, her shawl draped over the back of her chair, her tea cold on the table. Daniel stood alone by the railing, his phone in his hand, a new message glowing on the screen. Training program approved. Investor memo goes out tomorrow. Your call on next steps. He didn't reply. He set the phone down and looked out at the orchard, its shadows deep and still, the stars above burning with a light that felt ancient, unchanging. He thought of his mother's words, her quiet strength, her ability to see beyond the hurt to something larger, something worth fighting for. He thought of the passengers, their silence a wound as deep as Vanessa's actions. He thought of the world he'd built, the one he'd believed was fair, and the cracks he'd seen in it today. And he made a silent promise, not to himself, not to the company, but to her, to keep fighting, not with anger, but with purpose. To make sure no one else sat in a carriage, a room, a life, and felt invisible. The night held its breath, and Daniel stood in its embrace, knowing the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. The morning sun rose gently over Daniel's countryside estate, its golden light filtering through the orchard, casting long shadows across the dew-kissed grass. Inside the villa, the air was quiet, filled with the soft scent of fresh coffee and the faint rustle of pages from a book Eleanor held but barely read. She sat by the terrace doors, her new gray shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, the stained one folded away like a memory she no longer needed to carry. The train incident lingered in her heart, not as a wound but as a spark, a moment that had changed more than she'd ever imagined. Outside, Daniel stood on the terrace, his silhouette sharp against the dawn, his phone silent for the first time in days. What began in a train carriage had grown into something larger, a movement, a reckoning, a legacy that would outlive them all. Today they'd face its final chapter, not with anger or revenge, but with a grace that demanded the world listen. Before we close this story, let me ask, has a moment of injustice ever inspired you to demand change? Not just for yourself, but for others. Share it in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if this tale's touched your heart, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another story like this. Now, let's see how Eleanor and Daniel's journey ends. The villa felt different this morning, as if the walls themselves had exhaled, releasing the tension of the past days. Eleanor set her book down, her eyes drifting to the orchard outside, where apples gleamed like small promises in the sunlight. She'd woken early, not from restlessness, but from a quiet clarity, a sense that the storm she'd weathered had cleared the air. The stain on her shawl was gone, but its meaning remained, a reminder of her strength, her son's devotion, and the power of a single moment to shift the world's perspective. She rose slowly, her steps steady, and joined Daniel on the terrace, her presence a silent anchor in the morning's calm. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft but carrying the warmth that always seemed to steady him. Daniel turned, a faint smile breaking through his usual reserve. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, his hands slipping into his pockets. "Too much to think about." Eleanor nodded, her eyes searching his face. "You've done a lot of thinking these past few days," she said. "More than you've let on." He didn't deny it. He looked out at the orchard, the trees standing tall and quiet, their roots deep in the earth. "I keep seeing you in that carriage," he said, his voice low, almost raw. "The way you sat there, so composed, even after what she did. I keep wondering how many times you've had to do that. Stay silent, stay strong, when I wasn't there to speak for you." Eleanor's smile was gentle, tinged with the weight of years. "More times than I can count," she said. "But I didn't stay silent because I was weak, Daniel. I stayed silent because I knew my worth, even when others didn't. And you reminded them of it." Her words landed softly, but they carried a force that made him pause. He'd spent his life building empires, shaping systems, bending the world to his vision. But this fight for his mother's dignity, for the dignity of everyone who'd ever been dismissed, it was different. It wasn't about power or wealth. It was about principle, about the quiet truths she'd taught him when they had nothing but each other. The terrace was bathed in light now, the sun climbing higher, its warmth chasing away the morning's chill. Lila appeared at the door, her tablet in hand, her expression professional but warm. "Mr. Harper," she said, "the train company sent the final documents. They're ready for your review. And there's something else. A letter from Ms. Klein." Daniel's brow furrowed, his eyes flicking to Eleanor. She didn't react, but her hands tightened slightly around her shawl, a subtle sign she was listening. "Read it," he said, his voice steady but curious. Lila hesitated, then opened the tablet and began. "Dear Mr. Harper and Mrs. Harper," she read, her voice clear but soft. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. What I did on that train was wrong, not because of who you are, but because of who I chose to be in that moment. I judged you, Mrs. Harper, without knowing you. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and I hurt you in a way I can't undo. I've spent every hour since then replaying it, seeing your face, your grace, and I'm ashamed. I'm stepping away from my role, not because I was asked to, but because I need to learn how to be better. I'm starting with this apology, not to clear my name, but to honor yours. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like. Sincerely, Vanessa Klein." The words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity and regret. Eleanor's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with something deeper, a recognition of pain transformed into accountability. Daniel stood still, his jaw tight, his mind turning over the letter's weight. It wasn't what he'd expected. Not a defense, not an excuse, but a confession, raw and unflinching. "What do you think?" he asked, turning to his mother, his voice quieter now. Eleanor took a slow breath, her gaze drifting to the orchard. "I think she's seen herself," she said. "Not the version she wanted to be, but the one she was. That's a start." Daniel nodded, but his expression was conflicted. "A start," he repeated. "What, but is it enough?" Eleanor's smile was faint but steady. "Enough for what, sweetheart? To erase what happened? No. To change her? Maybe. To change others? That's up to us." Her words were a compass, guiding him through the storm of his own emotions. He'd wanted justice, not just for her, but for every person who'd ever been made to feel small. But justice, he realized, wasn't a single act. It was a process, a commitment to building something better from the ashes of what was broken. What would you do with Vanessa's letter? Would you believe her? Or would it feel too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm eager to hear what you feel. Let's keep going. The train hummed softly as it sliced through the countryside, its sleek silver frame catching the late morning light. In the business-class carriage, a woman sat alone by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was older, her silver hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, her shawl draped carefully over her shoulders. She looked like someone you might pass without a second glance. Quiet, unassuming, her eyes tracing the blur of green hills outside. Her name was Eleanor, and to anyone watching, she was just another passenger. But when she asked for a simple cup of tea, the train attendant's response wasn't just rude, it was cruel. With a mocking smile, the attendant knocked the cup off her table, sending hot tea splashing across Eleanor's shawl. The carriage went silent. Passengers stared, then looked away. No one said a word. What no one knew was that the man seated behind her, tapping quietly on his tablet, wasn't just another traveler. He was her son, Daniel Harper, a man whose wealth and influence powered the very train they rode. And when he stood, the world around them shifted. Before we dive into this story, let me ask, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below, and if this kind of tale moves you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's begin. Eleanor stepped onto the train with the kind of grace that comes from years of carrying yourself through rooms where you're not always welcome. Her steps were soft, deliberate, her small leather bag held close to her side. The business-class carriage was a world of polished wood and plush seats, filled with the low hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. Men in tailored suits typed furiously on laptops. A woman in a silk scarf laughed into her phone. Eleanor didn't draw their eyes. She didn't want to. She gave a gentle nod to the attendant at the carriage door, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, dear," she said, her smile warm but fleeting. Then she made her way to seat 3A, settling by the window with a quiet sigh. Outside, the world rushed by, fields of gold and green, distant hills rolling under a pale sky. Eleanor adjusted her shawl, its soft cream fabric catching the light. She tucked her bag beneath her seat and smoothed her skirt, her hands moving with the care of someone who'd spent a lifetime making herself small to avoid trouble. The train hadn't yet left the station. She could hear the shuffle of footsteps, the rustle of coats being stowed, the faint chime of the departure announcement. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the carriage settle her nerves. It had been a long morning, and she hadn't eaten since dawn. Behind her, in seat 3B, sat a man who blended into the scene as effortlessly as she did. Daniel Harper wore a simple navy sweater, his dark hair slightly tousled, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hands. To anyone glancing his way, he was just another executive, maybe reviewing emails or checking stocks. But Daniel was no ordinary passenger. He was a renewable energy magnate, a quiet titan whose innovations powered half the technologies keeping this train on its tracks. His name wasn't on billboards or magazine covers. He preferred it that way. But his influence was everywhere, woven into the systems that made modern life hum. No one in the carriage knew he was Eleanor's son. Not the passengers, not the crew, not even the attendant who was about to change everything. A few minutes after the train pulled away from the platform, Eleanor pressed the small call button beside her seat. Her throat was dry, and a cup of tea felt like the kind of small comfort she deserved after a long day of travel. She didn't expect much, just a moment of kindness, a warm drink to steady her hands. The carriage was calm now, the initial bustle of boarding replaced by the soft clatter of keyboards and the occasional murmur of conversation. She waited, her fingers tracing the edge of her shawl, her eyes drifting back to the window. The attendant who appeared was a young woman named Vanessa Klein. Her uniform was crisp, her dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail that gleamed under the carriage lights. Her smile was polished but thin, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Eleanor looked up, her voice soft but clear. "Could I have a cup of tea, please? If it's no trouble." Vanessa's eyes flicked over her, down to the modest shawl, the worn leather bag, the absence of jewelry or anything that screamed wealth. Her lips twitched into something closer to a smirk than a smile. "Tea?" she repeated, as if Eleanor had asked for champagne. "We're still getting settled. You'll have to wait." She didn't linger for a response. She turned on her heel and strode back down the aisle, her steps clipped, her ponytail swinging like a metronome. Eleanor didn't react. She didn't sigh or frown or call after her. She just lowered her eyes to her hands, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her shawl. She'd heard that tone before, too many times to count. It was the sound of someone deciding she didn't belong, that her presence was an inconvenience, a mistake. She let the moment pass, her face unreadable, her heart heavy but steady. The train rocked gently beneath her, carrying her forward even as the sting of dismissal settled in her chest. A few minutes later, Vanessa returned, moving down the aisle with a tray of drinks. She stopped at a man in a pinstripe suit, offering him coffee with a laugh that felt rehearsed. She handed a sparkling water to a woman with diamond earrings, her voice warm and eager. When she reached Eleanor's row, she didn't stop, didn't glance her way. It was as if Eleanor's seat was empty, her existence erased from the carriage. Eleanor hesitated, then pressed the call button again, her touch light but deliberate. Vanessa froze mid-step, her tray rattling slightly. She turned, her smile gone, her eyes narrowing as she walked back to Eleanor's seat. "I told you," she said, her voice low but biting. "You need to wait. It's busy enough without you ringing that button every 5 seconds." The words landed like a slap, sharp and public. A few passengers glanced up, their eyes darting between Vanessa and Eleanor before quickly looking away. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. "I haven't had anything to drink today. I just thought—" "You thought what?" Vanessa cut her off, leaning closer, her tone dripping with disdain. "That you're the only one here who matters? Maybe you're not used to trains like this." The insult hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. A man across the aisle paused, his fingers hovering over his laptop. A woman 2 rows back lowered her phone, her lips parting slightly. The carriage wasn't loud, but it felt quieter now, the kind of quiet that swallows sound and leaves only tension in its place. Eleanor didn't respond. She looked down, her hands trembling just enough to betray her composure. Vanessa set a small cup of tea on the table in front of her, the motion so careless that it teetered on the edge. Before Eleanor could reach for it, Vanessa's hand flicked out, whether by accident or intent, no one could say for sure, and knocked the cup over. Hot tea spilled across the table, soaking into Eleanor's shawl, the dark stains spreading like a bruise. Eleanor gasped, a small, involuntary sound, her hands flying to the fabric as she tried to blot it with a napkin. Her cheeks flushed, not with anger, but with the raw, familiar ache of humiliation. That was when Daniel looked up. He'd been silent until now, his tablet glowing softly in his hands, his focus seemingly elsewhere. But the sound of that cup hitting the table, the sharp intake of his mother's breath, it cut through everything. He set the tablet down slowly, his movements precise, deliberate. He stood, his tall frame unfolding in the narrow aisle, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and impossibly calm. "Did you just knock my mother's tea off her table?" The carriage froze. The man with the laptop closed it with a soft click. The woman with the phone stopped scrolling. Even Vanessa seemed to pause, her smirk faltering as she registered the weight of his words. Eleanor didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the stained shawl, her hands still clutching the napkin, her shoulders rigid with the effort of holding herself together. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. He stepped into the aisle, his presence commanding without effort. "I asked you a question," he said, slower now, each word deliberate. "Did you just spill tea on my mother?" Vanessa's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes flicking from Daniel to Eleanor and back again. "I didn't know she was your mother," she stammered, her voice cracking slightly. "It was an accident, That's not what I asked," Daniel said, his tone unchanging, but there was a steel in it now, a quiet force that made the air feel heavier. "You mocked her, you insulted her, and then you spilled her tea. I want to know why." Vanessa took a step back, her tray clattering softly in her hands. The passengers were watching openly now, no longer pretending to be distracted. A woman in a red coat clutched her purse tighter. A man with glasses leaned forward, his breath catching. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the train and the distant clatter of dishes from the service area. "Sir," Vanessa tried again, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "It was a mistake. I was busy, and busy." Daniel interrupted, his voice still calm, but cutting through her excuse like a blade. You weren't too busy to laugh with the man in 4C. You weren't too busy to refill her glass 3 times. He nodded toward the woman with the diamond earrings, who flushed and looked away. But when my mother asked for tea, you decided she didn't deserve it. Why? Vanessa's mouth opened, but no words came. Her hands tightened around the tray, her knuckles white. I didn't mean. You meant it, Daniel said, taking a single step closer. You looked at her and decided she didn't belong here. You thought no one would care because she's quiet, because she's older, because she doesn't look like the rest of this carriage. You thought you could humiliate her, and no one would say a word. Eleanor's hands stilled. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the window, but her reflection showed the faintest glimmer of tears she refused to let fall. The stain on her shawl was darker now, the tea cooling against her skin, but she didn't move to dry it. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any protest, her dignity a shield stronger than any argument. Daniel's voice softened, but only slightly. You made a choice, Vanessa. You chose to treat my mother like she was invisible. But she's not invisible to me. The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the carriage. Vanessa's tray slipped from her hands, landing with a soft thud on the carpeted floor. She didn't bend to pick it up. She just stood there, her face a mask of panic and shame, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his tablet. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across his face. He typed a brief message, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Then he locked the screen and slid the tablet back into his bag. He didn't sit down. He didn't look away. He just stood there, a quiet storm in the middle of the aisle, waiting. Vanessa swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. If there's been a misunderstanding, I can get her another tea. I'll make this right. Daniel shook his head, almost imperceptibly. You can't make this right, he said. You broke something you can't fix with a cup of tea. The carriage was so quiet now you could hear the faint creak of the train as it rounded a curve. Vanessa turned and walked quickly toward the service area, her steps uneven, her shoulders hunched as if she could feel every eye on her back. The curtain swished shut behind her, but it didn't erase what had happened. The air in the carriage had changed, thickened with the weight of something raw and undeniable. Daniel sat down slowly, leaning forward to place a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. Eleanor turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. She didn't speak, but the look she gave him was enough, a mix of gratitude, pain, and something fiercer, something proud. It's okay, Mom, Daniel whispered, so softly only she could hear. I've got this. And he did. The message he'd sent was already spiraling outward, reaching people who could stop this train in its tracks if they chose. In the service area, Vanessa stood alone, her hands gripping the edge of a metal counter, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She didn't know who Daniel was, not yet, but she could feel the shift, the way the ground beneath her had begun to crack. What do you think so far? Has someone ever treated you or someone you love like they didn't belong? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Let's keep going. The train sped on, its rhythm unbroken, but inside the business class carriage, time seemed to slow. Passengers tried to return to their laptops, their books, their half-finished drinks, but their eyes kept drifting towards seat 3A, where Eleanor sat with her stained shawl and her unshaken grace. She hadn't moved much since the incident, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the hills outside. But there was something different about her now, something the other passengers could feel, even if they couldn't name it. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. Daniel sat behind her, his tablet untouched, his posture straight but relaxed. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to shout to be heard. His silence was louder, his calm more dangerous. He'd spent years building a world where people like his mother were supposed to be safe, respected, seen. He'd poured his wealth into technologies that made life smoother, faster, fairer, or so he thought. But today, in this carriage, he'd seen how little that mattered when someone decided another person wasn't worth a moment of kindness. The realization didn't make him angry, not in the way most people understood anger. It made him resolute. In the service area, Vanessa leaned against the counter, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. The curtain hid her from view, but it couldn't shield her from the truth. She'd crossed a line, and she knew it. She could still see Eleanor's face, the quiet shock, the way her hands trembled as she reached for the napkin, the way she didn't fight back. Vanessa had expected a reaction, an argument, something to justify her disdain. But Eleanor's silence had been worse. It had held a mirror up to Vanessa's actions, and what she saw in that reflection made her stomach twist. Another attendant, a younger woman named Claire, stepped into the service area, her expression cautious. "Vanessa," she said softly, "what happened out there?" Vanessa didn't look up. She grabbed a cloth and started wiping the counter, her movements jerky, as if she could scrub away the last 10 minutes. "She kept pressing the button," she muttered. "I told her to wait, and she wouldn't. Then her son got involved, acting like I'd committed a crime." Claire frowned, crossing her arms. "Her son? You mean the guy in 3B? Vanessa nodded, her jaw tight. "Yeah. Apparently, he's someone important." Claire hesitated, then lowered her voice. "That's Daniel Harper. His company funds half the tech on this train, the navigation systems, the booking platform, even the cameras. He's not just important, Vanessa. He's untouchable." Vanessa's hands froze on the cloth. The air in the service area seemed to thin, making it harder to breathe. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely audible. "You didn't have to know," Claire replied, her tone sharp but not unkind. "You just had to treat her like she mattered." Vanessa didn't respond. She turned away, her eyes burning, her mind racing with excuses she knew wouldn't hold. She'd worked this route for years, prided herself on her efficiency, her charm, her ability to read a room. She knew how to make the right passengers feel special. The ones with expensive watches, the ones who tipped well, the ones who looked like they belonged in business class. Eleanor hadn't fit that mold. She'd seemed out of place, too quiet, too plain, too old. Vanessa had made a snap judgment, and now that judgment was unraveling her. The train's intercom crackled softly, and a voice came through, calm but firm. "Attention, staff. Please report to the main service area for a brief update. This is non-passenger related." Vanessa's heart sank. She knew what was coming. She'd heard that tone before, never directed at her, but always signaling trouble. Claire gave her a sympathetic look but said nothing as they stepped out from behind the curtain. The carriage hadn't changed much in the minutes since Vanessa had retreated. Passengers were still seated, their eyes flickering toward her as she passed, their whispers too soft to catch but loud enough to feel. Eleanor hadn't moved, her shawl still damp, her face still turned toward the window. Daniel was looking at his tablet again, but his posture told Vanessa he hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't forgotten anything. In the main service area, the train's supervisor, a man named Mr. Ellis, stood waiting. His face was unreadable, his clipboard tucked under one arm. "Vanessa," he said as she approached, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "We've received a complaint, a serious one. I need you to stay here until we reach the next station. You're not to interact with the passenger in 3A or her son." Vanessa's throat tightened. "It was an accident," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I didn't mean to." Mr. Ellis raised a hand, cutting her off. "The onboard cameras caught everything. We'll review it at the station, but for now, you're off service. Station staff will meet us when we arrive." The words hit her like a physical blow. She nodded stiffly, her eyes dropping to the floor. Claire stood nearby, her silence heavy with disappointment, not anger. Vanessa wanted to argue, to explain, to make someone understand that she wasn't a bad person, that she'd just made a mistake. But the weight of Mr. Ellis's gaze, the memory of Eleanor's stained shawl, the echo of Daniel's voice, it all pressed down on her, leaving no room for excuses. Back in the carriage, Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers brushing the damp fabric of her shawl. The stain was a stark reminder of what had happened, a mark she couldn't hide. But she didn't try to. She let it be, let it sit there, a silent testament to the moment she'd endured. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers, their glances quick and cautious, as if they were afraid to linger too long. No one had spoken up when Vanessa mocked her. No one had moved when the tea spilled. They'd watched and they'd stayed silent, and that silence hurt almost as much as Vanessa's words. Daniel leaned forward again, his voice a whisper. "Mom, you okay?" Eleanor turned to him, her eyes soft but steady. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her. "Just tired." He nodded, his jaw tight. "We're almost at the next station. I've got people waiting. This isn't over." Eleanor reached out, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. "Don't let it consume you," she said quietly. "What she did was wrong, but don't let it change who you are." Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a moment. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about you, and everyone else who's ever been treated like that." Eleanor didn't argue. She gave a small nod and turned back to the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The hills outside were beautiful, but they couldn't erase the ache in her chest. The ache of being seen as less, of being dismissed in a room full of people who chose to look away. She'd spent her life navigating moments like this, swallowing the hurt, smiling through the disrespect. But today was different. Today, someone had seen her. Someone had spoken. And that someone was her son. The train slowed as it approached the next station, the platform visible through the windows, bustling with travelers and staff. The intercom dinged again, the conductor's voice smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be arriving shortly. Please remain seated until the train comes to a complete stop. We appreciate your patience." The words were ordinary, but they carried an undercurrent of something more. Passengers exchanged glances, their whispers growing slightly bolder. "Did you see what happened?" one woman murmured to her seatmate. "That attendant was out of line." Her companion nodded, his voice low. "Yeah, but the guy behind her, I heard he's someone big. This isn't going to end quietly." Daniel heard the whispers but didn't acknowledge them. He was focused on his tablet now, reading a message that had just come through. "Station security is in place. Company execs are on site, awaiting your instructions." He typed a quick reply. "No press. Keep it contained. I want a meeting with management the moment we disembark." He locked the screen and leaned back, his eyes flicking to his mother. She was still watching the window, her face calm but distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. In the service area, Vanessa stood alone again, Mr. Ellis having stepped away to coordinate with the station staff. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her nails digging into her palms. She could still hear Daniel's voice, the way he'd said invisible, the way it had cut through her defenses and left her raw. She wanted to believe she wasn't that person, the one who judged, who dismissed, who hurt, but the truth was staring her in the face, captured by cameras she couldn't deny, witnessed by a carriage full of strangers who'd seen her at her worst. Claire reappeared, her expression softer now. "Vanessa," she said, "they're going to ask for your statement when we stop. Just tell the truth." Vanessa nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The truth. What was the truth? That she'd seen an older woman in a plain shawl and decided she didn't belong? That she'd let her own assumptions guide her actions, her words, her hands? That she'd humiliated someone for no reason other than her own pride? The truth felt like a weight she couldn't carry, but she knew she'd have to face it soon. The train slowed further, the platform now fully in view. Passengers began gathering their belongings, but the energy in the carriage was different. Subdued, heavy, as if everyone knew something was about to happen. Eleanor adjusted her shawl, her movements slow and deliberate. The stain was still there, a dark patch against the cream fabric, but she wore it like a badge now, not of shame, but of survival. She'd been through worse than this, she told herself. She'd carried heavier burdens. But this moment, this public wound, it hurt in a way she hadn't expected. Daniel stood as the train came to a stop, offering his hand to help her up. "Ready?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Eleanor took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Ready," she said, though her heart wasn't sure. She rose from her seat, her head held high, her shawl draped proudly over her shoulders. The other passengers watched, some with curiosity, some with guilt, some with a quiet respect they hadn't shown before. She didn't meet their eyes. She didn't need to. She walked down the aisle with Daniel behind her, each step a reclaiming of the space Vanessa had tried to take away. As they reached the door, a man in a dark suit stepped onto the train, his badge identifying him as station security. Behind him was a woman in a tailored blazer, her face professional but strained. She carried a tablet and a leather folder, her eyes scanning the carriage before landing on Daniel. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice low and respectful. "We're here to assist you and your mother. There's a private room ready at the station." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you," he said, his tone clipped but polite. He guided Eleanor toward the door, his hand resting lightly on her elbow. The passengers watched them go, their whispers filling the carriage like a soft tide. "That's him," someone murmured. "I knew he looked familiar." Another voice, quieter. "She didn't deserve that. No one does." The platform was a blur of motion, travelers rushing to catch connections, staff pushing luggage carts, the hum of announcements overhead. But for Eleanor, it was quiet. The world seemed to fade around her, leaving only the steady rhythm of her breath, the weight of her son's presence beside her, the memory of a moment that had changed everything. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't invisible anymore. And neither was Daniel. As they stepped off the train, the station staff parted to let them through, their faces a mix of deference and unease. A small crowd had gathered near the platform's edge, some recognizing Daniel from business headlines, others simply curious about the tension in the air. He didn't acknowledge them. He kept his focus on his mother, guiding her toward a set of glass doors that led to a private corridor. Behind them, Vanessa emerged from the service area, flanked by Mr. Ellis and another staff member. Her face was pale, her uniform slightly wrinkled, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't see Eleanor or Daniel, didn't know they'd already left the train. She walked with her head down, her steps heavy, as if each one carried the weight of what she'd done. The platform staff glanced her way, their expressions unreadable, but she could feel their judgment, their questions, their whispers. What would you have done in that carriage? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent? Let me know in the comments. It's a question worth asking. For now, the story's just beginning. The corridor was quiet, its walls lined with soft lights and framed posters of sleek trains gliding through scenic landscapes. Eleanor and Daniel walked in silence, the security officer leading the way, the woman with the tablet trailing behind. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, a stark contrast to the chaos of the platform outside. Eleanor's shawl brushed against her arms, the stain still visible, still heavy with meaning. She didn't try to hide it. She didn't need to. At the end of the corridor was a door marked VIP Meeting Room. The security officer opened it, revealing a space that felt more like a private lounge than an office. Plush chairs surrounded a glass table, a tray of bottled water and pastries untouched in the center. A wide window overlooked the station concourse, the bustle of travelers reduced to a distant hum. Eleanor sat near the window, her movements slow but steady. Daniel remained standing, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the room. The woman with the tablet stepped forward, her voice careful. "Mr. Harper, I'm Miss Carter, head of passenger relations. On behalf of the company, I want to apologize for what happened today. It was unacceptable, and we're taking immediate steps to address it." Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked at his mother, waiting for her to speak first. Eleanor met Miss Carter's eyes, her expression calm but unflinching. "It's not just about me," she said softly. "It's about every person who's ever been made to feel small because of how they look or who they are." Miss Carter nodded, her face tightening slightly. "I understand, ma'am. We've already suspended the attendant involved and we're reviewing the footage from the onboard cameras. There will be consequences." "Consequences," Daniel repeated, his voice low but sharp. "That's a start, but it's not enough." He stepped forward, his presence filling the room without effort. "My mother asked for a cup of tea. She was polite, she was kind. And your employee didn't just refuse her. She mocked her, humiliated her, and spilled tea on her in front of a carriage full of people who did nothing. That's not just one person's mistake. That's a culture that lets someone think they can treat a passenger like that and get away with it." Miss Carter's eyes flicked to her tablet, as if searching for a script that wasn't there. "We're committed to making this right, Mr. Harper. We've opened an investigation and—" "I don't want an investigation," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "I want change. I want mandatory sensitivity training for every employee, not just a checkbox exercise, but real accountability. I want a complaint system that actually listens to passengers, not one that buries their voices. And I want a memo sent to your investors detailing exactly what happened today and what you're doing to ensure it never happens again." The room fell silent. Miss Lay Carter hesitated, her fingers tightening around her tablet. "That's a significant request," she said carefully. "Going public with something like this could—" Inside, the villa was a haven of calm, its open spaces filled with light and the faint hum of life moving forward. Eleanor sat at the dining table, a fresh cup of tea in her hands, while Daniel reviewed the documents Lila had brought. The train company had followed through. Mandatory sensitivity training was set to begin. A new complaint system was in development, and the memo to investors had been sent, detailing the incident and the steps to prevent it from happening again. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a foundation, a promise that the world could learn from one woman's pain. Daniel set the tablet down, his eyes meeting his mother's. "They're doing everything we asked," he said. "More, even. They're auditing their entire staff culture." Eleanor nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "That's something," she said, "but it's not the end." He leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes clear and fierce. "Change doesn't stop with a memo or a training session," she said. "It stops when people stop looking at someone like me and deciding I don't belong. When they stop staying silent because it's easier. That's the real work, Daniel. Not just for you, but for all of them." Her words were a call, not just to him but to everyone who'd witnessed the incident, everyone who'd carry its memory. Daniel felt it in his chest, a fire that wasn't anger but purpose, a vow to keep pushing, not for revenge but for progress. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his grip gentle but firm. "I hear you," he said, "and I'm not stopping." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her smile a mix of pride and peace. "I know," she said. "You never have." The mornings stretched on, the villa alive with small moments of connection, Lila bringing fresh pastries, Eleanor sharing a story from Daniel's childhood, the two of them laughing over memories that felt like anchors in a shifting world. But beneath the warmth was a quiet resolve, a shared understanding that the story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to the passengers who'd watched in silence, to Vanessa, who'd faced her own reflection, to the countless others who'd hear of it and feel its echo in their own lives. Across the city, Vanessa sat in a small cafe, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The noise of the world buzzed around her, clinking cups, murmured conversations, the hiss of an espresso machine, but she was elsewhere, lost in the letter she'd written, the choices she'd made, the person she wanted to become. Her phone lay on the table, its screen dark, but she hadn't checked it in hours. She didn't need to. The answers she was searching for weren't in messages or notifications. They were in the quiet work of rebuilding herself, step by painful step. She'd resigned from the train company that morning, not because they'd forced her, but because she knew she couldn't wear that uniform again. Not without seeing Eleanor's face, hearing Daniel's voice, feeling the weight of her own actions. It wasn't punishment. It was accountability. A choice to step away from the person she'd been and toward something better. She'd enrolled in a community program, one that trained people to listen, to understand, to bridge gaps she'd once widened. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning, a seed planted in the wreckage of her mistake. The cafe door opened and Claire stepped in, spotting Vanessa immediately. She slid into the seat across from her, her expression cautious but kind. "You didn't call," she said, her voice gentle. "I got worried." Vanessa managed a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't know what to say," she admitted. "I still don't." Claire nodded, her hands folding on the table. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Just keep going. What you wrote in that letter, it wasn't nothing. It was real." Vanessa's throat tightened, her fingers gripping the mug. "I hurt her, Claire," she said, her voice barely audible. "I looked at her and decided she wasn't worth my time. How do you come back from that?" Claire leaned forward, her eyes steady. "You don't come back," she said. "You move forward. You learn. You change." That's what she'd want. Not your shame, but your growth. The words were simple, but they cut through Vanessa's fog, offering a path where she'd seen only walls. She nodded, her eyes glistening, and for the first time since the train, she felt a flicker of hope. Not for forgiveness, but for the chance to be different. To make amends not with words, but with actions. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after a mistake? What helped you find your way? Share your story in the comments. It's a safe space, and we're all listening. Let's return to the villa for the final moments. Back at the estate, the day unfolded with a quiet rhythm, the kind that felt like healing. Daniel stood in his office, the documents signed, the changes set in motion. The train company's memo had gone out, not as a publicity stunt, but as a commitment, a public acknowledgement that one passenger's pain had sparked a transformation. Sensitivity training was underway, complaint systems were being rebuilt, and whispers of the incident were spreading, not as gossip, but as a story of accountability, of a son's love, of a woman's grace. He stepped onto the terrace where Eleanor was waiting, her shawl catching the breeze, her eyes fixed on the orchard. She looked different now, not older, not younger, but stronger, as if the weight of being unseen had lifted, leaving only the truth of who she was. She turned to him, her smile soft but radiant, and for a moment they were just mother and son, standing in the light of a day they'd shaped together. "You did it," she said, her voice carrying a pride that warmed him deeper than the sun. "We did it," he corrected, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You showed them what strength looks like, Mom. I just made sure they listened." Eleanor laughed, a sound that felt like music after days of silence. "You've always been stubborn," she said, "just like me." They walked through the orchard together, the trees whispering around them, their branches heavy with fruit that would soon be harvested. The air was sweet, the world alive with possibility. Eleanor paused by a tree, her fingers brushing an apple, its red skin gleaming in the light. "You know," she said, her voice soft but clear, "what happened on that train? It wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever felt invisible. Every voice that's been ignored. We gave them a story, Daniel. Something to hold on to when the world tries to push them down." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "And they'll carry it," he said. "Not just the passengers, not just Vanessa, but everyone who hears it. They'll remember." Eleanor's eyes shone with tears she didn't try to hide. "That's all I've ever wanted," she said. "To be remembered, not for the pain, but for the hope." They stood there, side by side, the orchard stretching out before them, a testament to growth, to resilience, to the beauty that comes from roots that run deep. The incident on the train hadn't just exposed cruelty. It had revealed love, strength, and the power of standing up when others stay silent. It had changed Vanessa, not through punishment but through understanding. It had changed the passengers, planting seeds of courage in their silence. And it had changed Daniel and Eleanor, binding them closer, reminding them that their voices together could move mountains. The sun climbed higher, its light spilling across the hills, touching every corner of the world with a warmth that felt like forgiveness, not for what was done, but for what could be. The story didn't end with a headline or a verdict. It ended with a legacy, a quiet promise that no one would be invisible again. As they walked back to the villa, Eleanor's hand in Daniel's, the wind carried their laughter, soft and free, a sound that echoed beyond the trees, beyond the hills, into the hearts of those who'd never forget. The train had reached its destination, but the journey, the real journey, was just beginning. Not just for them, but for everyone who'd been touched by their story. This story's over, but its message isn't. What's the one thing you'll carry from Eleanor and Daniel's journey? Maybe it's love, maybe it's courage, maybe it's hope. Share it in the comments. I can't wait to read your thoughts. And if this moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human.